have Aston Martin without the initials DB, two names inextricably linked forever. Named after David Brown, the father of Aston Martin, the DB lineage is the quintessential Aston. Rapide, DBX Vantage, they're all come and go, but the Super GT DB bloodline has forever been the heart and soul of the British automaker. From the historic DB5 used in Goldfinger to the modern day success story that was the DB9, they've all stood apart in the auto industry as cars that invoke desire within the petrolhead. But now the DB9 bows out and Aston's second century plan begins with the birth of a new DB to spearhead the future, and that is the DB11.
So guys, here is the newest car of Aston's DB bloodline, and it's a really important car, this DB11, because it is meant to spearhead Aston's second century according to boss Andy Palmer. So this is meant to be a complete departure from the old cars, and it really is, because the older cars, the DB9 etc., were all based on Aston's V8 platform, and that was used for a good 15 years, which is a long time in automotive technology. This car, as soon as you look at it, you can see it is completely different. And it's not just the design. That platform is now gone, and the car is now based on a bonded aluminium platform. But we really need to tackle the design first. We'll talk about the platform and everything that has changed this car, including the Daimler Factor, later on. But first, the design. So it doesn't get more iconic Aston Martin Super GT than this. It's the same grille that you're pretty much familiar with from the previous DB cars. The lights, very similar as well. You've got the long GT bonnet, but it is brought forward now, and it looks more modern, it looks more up to date. It's got very, very muscular features, and it's very wide. This particular car, being the V8, has only got 2 bonnet nostrils, where the V12 has got 4 across it. But just this clamshell is a completely different piece of design. Let me show you this, what it looks like when it opens. So many little touches of quality that I love about this car, and this clamshell is one of them. It's actually the largest single piece of aluminium currently used in the automotive industry, and it's such an impressive looking thing. Underneath that is my little secret, and pretty much the reason I'm here today. It is actually an engine sourced by AMG. It's that engine I love, the 4-litre V8 BiTurbo, but we'll talk more about that later, because that's not the highlight of this car in my opinion. I was saying there's a lot of little details that I absolutely love, and one of them is when you close this bonnet, it does a self-close thing, which is just oozes quality. It's just something that I really expect out of like an S-Class or a Rolls-Royce, but it's here in this Super GT Aston, and it makes sense because this is the best British luxury automaker. Now that 3/4 view and the side of the car is where things begin to change. Those of you who are keen moviegoers, you'll notice the DB10's wheels from Bond's car, and you'll also notice another bit which is quite interesting, and this will start to give you an idea of how this car is designed more on aerodynamics, and that is this front wing here. You see this, there's no separation between where the wheel arch finishes and where the car's body begins. And underneath this wing, there's these little round areas. I'll show them to you now. They're called curlicues. And what they do is they push the air pressure through here, back into this recess in the C-pillar, and through into the boot. Now I'll have to open the boot to show you this particular part. Through here, and then out into this makeshift spoiler here, thus helping the car aerodynamically. It's such a clever design, and it was done because the Aston designers and technicians were given a task to design a car that didn't need a rear spoiler, and they've done it. This doesn't need a rear spoiler. It's all done through clever aerodynamics. Then of course you have the other famous part of the new DB11, which is the floating C-pillar. This somewhat splits opinion, and I think a lot of it depends on spec. Personally, this intense blue is a lovely color. I would personally have a go for a silver. Maybe that's the Bond fan inside me talking, I don't know. This floating C-pillar really depends on spec. That view I'm showing you now is probably my favorite view of the car, and it really shows the muscular shoulders on the side of this. It's just such a wide looking car. And what I'm quite surprised about overall is the dimensions and the footprint of it, because when I saw previous DB cars, they looked so much bigger to me, much more like your Bentley Continentals or your S-Class coupes. It just seems so much smaller, and Aston call this car a Super GT. So what they're saying is, yes, it is a Grand Tourer, but it crosses the line into supercar a little bit as well. And I can really see that here with the DB11. It's somewhat smaller like a supercar, lower, wider, but it has the attributes of a GT with the luxury, the 2+2 element. It's a really interesting niche that I don't think anyone else really does at the moment. Another bit that I really like is the exaggerated side sills. They look like something you'd see in a concept car, but never make it into production, yet here they are, and they look really good and give the middle of the car a really slim look. And now the rear quarter. Maybe this is the most problematic for most people because A, you're not used to the floating C-pillar idea. You see the curlicue area of the front wing there, and it doesn't quite remind you of the old DB cars. But you cannot deny that the rear tail lights are absolutely Aston Martin. You remove the badges here and you just look at the tail lights, you know that this is an Aston. And then the lovely wide shoulders of the back of the car. It's properly a GT. You've got quite an aggressive rear diffuser here. The pipes are real pipes for those of us who hate having fake pipes on the outsides. So that's a really nice touch. They protrude, they're massive, they look really good. And generally the rear of the car, very Aston Martin, but it has taken some time for us all to get used to this new design. But of course it's meant to be a complete new departure for Aston, and it is. And I still think it's one of the most beautiful cars on the road at the moment. The new Vantage has taken things forward even more. It'll be really interesting to see how the DBS does, how that's going to be designed, the new one. We've seen it running around the Nürburgring extremely quickly. And just one note before I crawl in, Aston have this lovely thing called swan doors. So whereas in pictures and stuff, it may look like just a normal door to you, these doors actually swing slightly upward. I guess the best way to describe it would be a marriage between a Lamborghini scissor doors and normal door hinges. So they kind of go upwards, but they don't sort of swing back into the car, and they don't suddenly jut out as if they've got notches, so they'll hit another car next to it. And they're really light. Yeah, I'm really a fan of these swan doors. They're just really easy to open and close. Plus they look good when they go slightly upward. They're not going to hit any curbs. Really nice. Right, is this or is this not one of the most gorgeous interiors you've ever seen in a car before? Forget what type of car, luxury or otherwise, this is just gorgeous. And this isn't something new. Aston have always been known for their incredible interiors, their leather workmanship, and this car has just taken it to another level, and it's brought things in that were perhaps missing before. So first and most importantly is the new steering wheel. We had the old one just for too long. It didn't look right in what was otherwise such lovely interiors. This one, much more like what you saw in the concept DB10. It's a lot smaller. It's slightly flat bottomed. It's just got a lovely ergonomic feel to it. And then you come to the materials and the switchgear inside here. When I visited Aston at Silverstone to pick the car up, they had a bunch of Vantages there with different spec boxes, and they had some of the materials that are used also in this car, such as the inside door handles. And they've got such a quality to them. They're actually aluminium, and they've got that cold metal touch, and it's used all around the car, and it gives it a really premium touch. Otherwise, the center console is classic Aston, just brought forward, just modernized. There are some lovely touches in here. For example, if you look at the engine start-stop button, if I push the brake, it goes red. And it's just these little details that really endear you to a car. And when I saw this stuff, I just absolutely fell in love with it. The seats are really comfortable, and the stitching is just out of this world. The DB11 is the first car to have leather broguing done inside these seats and on the door cards and all over the car, and it just looks lovely. I've sat in a lot of supercars, a lot of luxury cars, and this DB11 would shame pretty much all of them. The handcrafted look of the interior is just spot on. And quite rightly, they even proudly display on the side sill as you walk in, hand built in England. You'll come out of this and sit in something like a 488 GTB and you'll be sorely disappointed with how the stitching and the leather just isn't up to par. Switches have a lovely clicking sound, the buttons on the steering wheel are really solid, much better than what they used to be in the previous DB cars. One bit I quite like is having the seat adjustment on this side, because it means I can adjust the passenger seat if need be, and that's quite important, as we found using this car, that when you have someone in the back you can adjust this from here rather than having to stretch across and try and get the ones that are usually either on the seat on the other side or on the door. Another bit that I really liked is this center compartment here. It's got a button here that opens it up, and you can go sort of halfway or as much or as little as you want, and there's a lot of storage in here. But there's been some really clever space saving where the cup holders can actually be stowed away, and it's a brilliant little design feature. The roof lining is stunning. It's like looking at a beautifully crafted leather bag. It's just lovely with this cloth matched with the leather. And then one of my favorite bits is having the lights here that turn on and off just by a touch. It's just a little detail, but it's just small things like this that I really like inside here. But now we must address what I am calling the Daimler Factor. You may or may not know that Aston Martin are now in a technical partnership with Daimler or Mercedes Benz. So there's a lot of components that we'll talk about specifically to do with performance that have come in, but you'll notice a lot as soon as you get in the car, because the car's electronic basis is based on the Mercedes Benz system. And you'll see things that'll give it away very early, such as the MB touchpad here and the rotating knob for the command system, and indeed the system itself. So if we start this up and have a look, you get the DB11 logo, which is lovely. So it's all been reskinned, but it is, when you look at it then, Mercedes' command system just changed by Aston. But there's nothing wrong with that. The previous system in Aston just seemed like a bolt-on. It was far removed from the lovely interior, and it was too dated in terms of its functions, whereas the command system is well tested, is still used currently in Mercedes like my AMG GTR, and it's a really good infotainment system. It's very logical in its setup. Yes, perhaps they could have changed it more, but what would have been the point when the function flows really well? It would have just been a case of changing something for the sake of changing it. It's a tool for a purpose. It works way better than what came before it, and it should be lauded as a big positive. One controversial area in this car is the driver zone. It's now gone digital, and people have been slightly upset by this. I actually really like it, and I'll talk more about it when we drive, but just having the physical round structure of the rev meter and the two displays on the side, the graphics, maybe they could be improved, but they're not over exaggerated as if they're trying to be real dials. They are digital. In terms of its function, it's great because you can customize what you see on both screens, and the middle rev counter is really clean, and it changes as you're driving, and I'll show you that when we go on the drive. The other bit you'll notice from Mercedes-Benz are the stalks here. Again, they work well. I don't see a big problem here. All the buttons here, they're all touch, and they give you a sound recognition when you press them. Of course, you got the iconic buttons for park, reverse, neutral and drive here, which is very Aston Martin, and they have remained as they should. The rear space, it is a 2+2. It's not a four-seater per se, so you must think more on the lines of Porsche 911 than something like the S Coupe. I'm not going to climb in it like I normally would because it's not for adults. It is more for kids, but it is nicely upholstered just like the rest of the car. It looks beautiful. So let's turn this baby on and see what this AMG sourced V8 in Aston tune sounds like. Now that sounded really good, but it wasn't like the AMGs, and you guys who've seen a lot of my AMG videos will recognize that authentic sound of the AMG engine, it isn't quite there because this is a different tune of the engine by Aston. The exhaust system is different as well, so this is bound to sound different. Now there's different modes within here which will change the sound. So we're in GT at the moment, which is the comfort mode. If we hit it into sport, you'll hear the flaps open up and immediately it's louder. But let's put it into GT first and I'll show you what the revs sound like. Now that's very Aston Martin. Doesn't sound AMG to me. I'm going to stick it into sport as well. Again, it's similar, but it is different. The overruns remind you of the AMG, but this has got a very different sort of tune to it, if that makes sense. Sport Plus, louder. I think revving that on standstill, it's actually a lot louder than a lot of the AMGs that I've revved in Sport Plus. Certainly the build-up is a lot louder, if not the pops and bangs, but it's a really nice tune. I'm quite excited to see what this sounds like when we're driving it in more speed on the road. So why don't we go and do that? So let's get this car on the road, drive it in a bit more anger, see what the GT cruising ability of the car is like, and decide what we think of this V8 DB11. So the new spearhead of the DB bloodline by Aston, and it's probably surmised best by Aston themselves when talking about this V8 in particular, is that it's a refined and comfortable GT with more sporting bias, and that's a really good summary of what this V8 DB11 is like. First impressions of this car when I started driving it was just a complete dream, because I feel it's just one of those brands that really A, hits home for us because it's British designed, and B, then you've got the James Bond factor. There's just such a aura of heritage and excellence behind it that you can't help but pine for one of these. And it was always the case with, especially when the DB9 came out, what a car that was, and then the DBS that followed. And it's just a dream just driving one of these. It's like a life tick box for me. So I've got the car in GT mode, which is the most comfortable setting on both the gearbox and the suspension. Now in terms of the DB11, gone is the old V8 platform, and now the car sits on a bonded aluminium platform, which makes it lighter, 39% stiffer, and you also get a bit more room inside the car. Now Daimler AG, better known by their best brand, Mercedes Benz, are now in a technological partnership with Aston Martin, and that means they're sharing components and helping each other with R&D. And what that means for the DB11 specifically is that for the first time we've got a multi-link rear suspension in the car. We've got torque vectoring by braking in an Aston for a first time. Obviously we've got all the electronic components within the car that we discussed earlier in terms of the interior and the infotainment system, and most crucially is the turbocharging and the engine itself, and that is where I come in. So if there's anyone who knows that 4-litre AMG like the back of their hand, it's me. And that is the engine that is now shared with Aston Martin. It was given to them to develop in conjunction with AMG. It's funny, when we went on the AMG road trip and we were in a Falterbach, there was a lot of DB11s, a lot of the new Vantage there, all being tested hand in hand with AMG, as it should be. And now Aston have tuned this engine to their own flavour, and it really is their own flavour. Yes, it is sourced from AMG, and it is their current engine. It's not some hand-me-down from the past. In fact, in my opinion, as you heard in the S63 review, it is the best all-round engine that AMG have ever made. It is an awesome V8 BiTurbo 4-litre engine. It's probably the best BiTurbo V8 in the world, certainly orally, in my opinion. In terms of power as well, the way that the power curve is so linear like a natural engine, It is fantastic, and you'll find this engine in cars like the AMG GTR, the latest C63, the S63, the E63. It really is a current staple of AMG, and you can see how serious then the technological partnership between Aston and AMG is, that they're sharing their absolute flagship engine with Aston in order for them to modify it for their own uses. And this is a big win for Aston, in my opinion. So this car has the familiar 503 brake horsepower. It's got 675 Newton meters of torque. 0 to 60 is 4 seconds. So this is all great performance increases compared to the previous DBs. But what's interesting is when you compare it instead to the V12 version of the DB11, and that car produces 600 brake horsepower and it's got 700 Newton meters of torque. So it's only 25 Newton meters more in terms of torque. So basically, these are very comparable. With the Hot V setup inside this engine, there is no delay. The car doesn't feel like a turbo engine. It feels like a natural one. And that is the big plus point of this engine. That, along with the torque, makes this just one of the sweetest V8s in the world. But the main reason of bringing the V8 into this is the massive weight saving of 115 kg. Now that is a huge amount, and it drops the curb weight of the DB11 down to 1760 kg, which is so much lighter than the V12, and it shows immediately. We'll get onto the handling and how this has transformed the car, but that is significant in terms of weight saving. When you look at cars like the M4 CS, which have dropped by just 30 kg and are a more stripped out driver focused version, even cars like the R8 RWS that we reviewed recently, that had been dropped by 50 kg, but this is 115 kg lower than the V12, and you cannot underestimate that figure, and you really feel it on the road. But before I get to that, let's talk about this engine, because it's scary. Change is always scary for petrol heads, and the Aston Martin customer is no different to the rest of us. When you hear that an AMG engine is coming, and the AMGs are so well known for their own characterful sound in the V8, you don't want your own heritage and your own history to be overtaken by what you perceive as outside influence. Now, to deal with this, I'm going to stick the car into Sport first, and then we'll go into Sport Plus. But in Sport, let's talk about the sound. Now, Aston Martin customers care about sound, just like AMG ones do. So if you said to an AMG customer that you're getting an engine from somewhere else, we would also be scared that would it sound still like an AMG. So you have to understand the mindset. I wouldn't be so quick to criticize Aston customers who have this feeling of fear. But let's put that to rest, because as you can hear, it doesn't sound anything like the AMG V8. It's a more refined sound. It's not as brutal. It's got a certain class to it that you don't find in AMG soundtrack. Of course, this is an Aston Martin produced exhaust system and the ECU. The engine has been tuned for Aston. So even in Sport, you're not getting any of the character that you would find, say, in the S63 or the AMG GT. The pops, the crackles, the overbangs, that very AMG rumble, it's not there. Instead, you've got a very refined sounding V8, still good in terms of volume, but it's not AMG. Allow me to give you more proof. Let's move up to Sport Plus. There is a bit of overrun, nothing like the AMG. It's a really nice, unique sound in itself. It's what I imagine a V8 Aston should sound like, having driven the V12. If anything, it's a bit more characterful than that V12 in the DB11. This is a really nice exhaust setup by Aston. It's not AMG, but it's beautiful on its own. I keep using this word, refinement. That's probably the best word that I can think of at the moment to describe it. Whether AMG is a complete brute, this is a more sophisticated sound. with the startup and the revs earlier as well, it's got a different tune to it. So this is great. You need to rest assured this is not an AMG sounding engine in an Aston Martin. It's got its own unique character, just like Aston Customers wanted. The engine also gets new engine mounts from Aston Martin. There's a slimline wet sump as well to get the lowest center of gravity as possible. My Aston contact made sure I understood that it's 49-51 bias to the rear, not 50-50. So there's a lovely balance to this car in terms of its weight. So bringing in the V8 has allowed Aston to make other changes around the car to perhaps improve it for this particular engine, but it seems to improve the drive anyway. So we've got different brake pistons. The electronic steering has been modified, and we'll get onto the steering later, which is a big plus point. The springs are also softer, the rear suspension has been tweaked, the bushings are harder, so it's all a bit of a different package to the V12, and the two cars really do set themselves apart at the end of it, and we'll talk about that soon. And you saw in comfort, the car just glides along. The power delivery is very smooth, the gear changes from the 8-speed ZF, very smooth. But what's the power delivery like when you push it up to sport now? Sport mode really reaches a nice balance in this car, where it's got just enough V8 rumble without any over-on or pops and bangs, and the engine itself is really responsive without being jerky, and you can really just cruise along and enjoy what is one of the most luxurious super GTs in the world. Now if we pop the car into Sport Plus, there's no delay, there's so much power available. You really feel the 675 Newton meters of torque. That pulling power is lovely, and it wasn't in the previous DBs. If anything, it feels very similar in power to the V12 on the road. And it's not surprising considering how much weight is dropped, so the power to weight ratio will be more even, how the torque figure is nigh identical. This is really turning into what seems to be the DB11 to have. Now if we switch into manual, let's see what this ZF box is like. Seems very keen to downshift. Upshifts are good as well. Oh, it's very smooth. This is a really good gearbox. As you reach the higher part of the revs, the engine really begins to scream. The engine and the gearbox is still willing. To downshifts on demand, upshifts are sharp. I really like this gearbox. I was not expecting that. Now let's talk about the suspension, the handling. There's 3 stages here, just like the engine. So you've got GT Sport and Sport Plus. I've kept it primarily in comfort, but Sport is a really nice mix. Let's start with that first. You get a bit more feeling in terms of the body roll of the car, just enough, and the suspension isn't too bumpy. Trying Sport Plus, I actually find the suspension quite usable, even though generally in this car the suspension is a bit stiffer, but weirdly there doesn't seem to be a big jump in uncomfortableness, if that makes sense, between the 3 modes. But I still like to keep, I think, Sport as our suspension setting. Now the steering, this is the big highlight for me. It's probably my standout feature of this V8 DB11, other than the engine. The steering is so much more precise. I think the rear end is a bit more energetic, which makes this quite exciting to drive. But all in all, you really feel the weight difference of this car compared to the V12, and it makes it a completely different car. I think the way that I would surmise it is the V12 Aston is a better cruiser, but this, you get the best of both worlds, because you can really get some proper handling and sports car-like enjoyment out of this, which I don't think you can in the V12. It's too refined. Whereas this will reward you for driving faster, and it gets really exciting. I have no doubt in my mind that in the real world, on roads like this V8 will be as fast, if not faster. I'm really loving how you could cruise along as we were before, but if you get a nice stretch of road, you could be more precise with the car. The car really corners quite flat. I think it's almost too flat actually, because a bit of body roll will give you some idea of how much grip you have left. And I think that's perhaps the only thing I'd say is missing. I'm not sure of the grip level when we're really pushing it in the corners. But then I remember that this is a DB car and I'm driving it as fast as I am, and it's actually performing really, really well. But then equally I can just chuck it straight back into GT mode and it's a refined, sedate DB car. What a great mix this is. It is so nice just to cruise along in this car, even in GT mode. You get nice sound, the suspension is pretty decent. I would say, let's talk about daily use. In daily use, this isn't as good of a GT cruiser as the V12. If you want a car that cruises better, I would say the V12 would be the car to have. The MPG is really good in the V8. You can get 25, 26, 27 driving with mixed driving, which is really good for a car that's pushing over 500 horsepower. It's got a boot that's double the size of its predecessor. You've got a few inches more room in head height and leg room in the rear, even though it's not super significant. Of course, the infotainment is miles and miles better than what you had before in Astons. Yes, the cruising isn't as smooth in this V8, but I think this is perhaps the direction that Aston are going with their cars, especially these kind of more driver-focused versions. With the Valkyrie sitting at the top, AMR becoming much more of a focus for them, it's not surprising to see one of the two DB11s that you can choose being slightly stiffer, slightly more rewarding when you're driving fast, yet still doing the GT thing pretty well. So to conclude, let's get the Daimler Factor out the way first, because I think we need to summarize that point. What you're getting from Mercedes, and specifically from AMG, is firstly one of the best V8s in the world. In my opinion, it is the best V8 in the world, and Aston have been allowed to tune it and change it, and they have. This is a completely different engine in sound to the AMG. It feels more Aston in every way to me. So that is a massive, massive win for Aston Martin. And I get when customers say, look, it's not built at home like the V12 is. But guys, look, the Pagani's engines aren't built at home either. They're built with AMG. The real litmus test is, what is the feeling afterward? And if Aston are proud enough to put their nameplate on that engine, having worked on it, and you can see from this review just how Aston it is, you need to let go of your fear now and go and try one of these, because you will be pleasantly surprised. At the end of the day, this is a tool for a purpose, and the litmus test is this a genuine Aston Martin, or is it AMG doing Aston cosplay? And I'm going to say it's the former. This feels so much like an Aston, and it sounds like an Aston. The engine reduces the weight massively. It gives Aston customers the choice of a more agile DB11. So, partnership with Daimler, a big plus. I must make special note to the steering wheel again. This is such a nice steering wheel to drive, both in a dynamic way and just to cruise around in. It's just so well shaped. It's so much better than the old one. I like the metallic pitch shift paddles here as well. It's really well done. So as the first car of the second century Aston plan, this DB11 brings the game forward massively compared to its predecessors in the DB bloodline. The interior is still unmistakably Aston, especially the center console, but everything has got a higher level of refinement now. The clever aerodynamic design of the car brings the game forward massively for Aston into braver territory, but still holds on to their heritage. It's unmistakably an Aston Martin with the badges removed. If you are ever unsure about making the leap to the luxury British automaker, driving this DB11 will shed any doubt in your mind. It's a great indicator for Aston's future, and I can't wait to see what else they have planned. Soon we'll be testing the new V8 Vantage, which is going to be an incredible car. There's also the DB11 AMR, which is an updated version of the V12. As an AMG driver, I feel this is a completely different car, but as a potential customer to Aston Martin, I'm really tempted by this car and their future lineup. Guys, thank you so much for watching. It's been an absolute blast driving the DB11. Please do like, subscribe and share as you always do. Stay tuned for more Aston Martin on RBR, and we'll see you again soon.